Okay. We'll be starting in just a moment. I want to give everybody a minute to log in, but I want to welcome everybody to our webinar today. Very excited because it is one that we have never done before here with Connectionology, and you are going to learn so much about airbags from one of the best experts in the world, including Jessica and Sam, who are also incredible trial lawyers who are going to be teaching you a lot of wonderful things today as well. Later in this webinar, you're going to meet my great partners over at OnPoint Legal Nurse Consulting, Fox-AE, EmotionTrac, and HMR. So we will take a short break later in this webinar. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar. This is what makes these webinars so cool, is when we can answer your questions in real time. So please ask away, and you can put those questions in the Q&A box or the chat box. We will keep an eye on those. And now that most people are starting to join in, I'm going to go ahead and get started because I know that we want to cover a lot of things. I'm going to first introduce Sam Mason. And Sam, if you guys don't know, incredible attorney that works with Satch Oliver in Arkansas. And he actually just did a wonderful webinar that I'm going to be posting on our YouTube channel shortly. So be sure to keep an eye on that. But he had an amazing verdict, and that is what we talked about in this webinar that he did. So keep an eye out. He grew up in Calico Rock, Arkansas. He graduated from the University of Arkansas in 2016 with a bachelor's degree in political science. And he also graduated from law school from the University of Arkansas in 2019. But he started working as a trial lawyer at the Oliver Law Firm in 2019, and he now leads all of the Generations trial team at the Oliver Law Firm. And something that's very neat about Sam is that he is the president of the Benton County Bar Association, and he's been a president from 2022 to 2024. He's a member of the Arkansas Bar Association, the Arkansas Trial Lawyers Association, which is a great group, the American Association for Justice, who I believe everybody is actually traveling out to this week for their big convention in Nashville. And he's also a member of the Academy of Truck Accident Attorneys, and he's chair-elect for the Arkansas Bar Association's Young Lawyers section. And some neat things about Sam, some of his hobbies is that he enjoys spending time with his friends and his family, and he specifically enjoys traveling, boating, watching movies, reading, hunting, fishing, and spending time on his family's farm in Calico Rock, which sounds like an absolutely gorgeous place, Sam. So I think we will all have to go visit you sometime as well.
That sounds great. Thanks, Ginger.
And now my dear friend, Jessica, you guys have seen her also on a lot of our webinars that we have done. Great trial lawyer, again, who works with John Romano down in the Romano Law Group in West Palm Beach. She is actually a Palm Beach County native, and she graduated from the Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton, Florida, with a Bachelor's of Business Administration. And she attended the Barry University School of Law in Orlando, where she graduated early with her Juris Doctorate degree in December 2013. So one thing I think that's really neat is before she started working with John, she served as an assistant state attorney, where she gained a lot of invaluable trial and litigation experience. And then she joined the private sector, working for a prominent civil litigation defense firm, handling a lot of those complex litigation matters. But now she focuses a lot of her career and her practice on representing plaintiffs in catastrophic injury matters. And those include wrongful death, auto negligence, medical malpractice, premises liability, as well as product liability. And she is a powerhouse in the community. So she is also, like Sam, very involved in a lot of great organizations, and she has risen up throughout a lot of them as well. And we are so proud to have her with us. So Jessica and Sam, I'm going to hand this over to you guys, and then I'll let you introduce Chris.
Thanks, Ginger. And thank you guys all for being here today. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Chris. So we have an exciting presentation for you. Chris Caruso, he's an accomplished engineer specializing in automotive safety with extensive experience in analyzing vehicle crashes and developing safety systems. He holds a Master of Science in Engineering and dual Bachelor of Science degrees in Electrical and Mechanical Engineering. Chris has been pivotal in evaluating the performance of safety systems, identifying defects, and researching new technologies to enhance occupant protection. He contributed to advancements in airbag sensing and occupant detection systems, and is recognized for at least 6 patents in automotive safety technology and has received multiple awards for engineering excellence. Chris and I have worked in several airbag cases and non-deploy, and then we'll talk about a little bit other cases that they involve airbags, but not necessarily cases that we took into product liabilities. But in the world of airbag product liability cases, Chris Caruso is the airbag expert. So thank you, Chris, so much for being here today. Appreciate it. And I think everyone here is going to enjoy what you have to say, and they're going to learn a lot. But the first thing I'd like you to do is just kind of give everyone an overview of a little more. I know I gave a little bit, but your background and where you started and how you got to the point you are at now.
Well, thank you for the great introduction. Can you hear me okay? Am I coming through okay?
You are.
I was born and raised in New Jersey. When I graduated high school, actually right before I graduated high school, I was recruited by General Motors Institute in Flint, Michigan. I was one of the top of my class in graduating from high school. So after seeing what they had to offer, I ended up signing on to be a General Motors Institute engineer. It was a 5-year cooperative program, and as Jessica said, I graduated with a bachelor's in both electrical and mechanical engineering. This ends up being important in a few minutes. From there, I was working for a Fisher Body division of General Motors, just a hardware plant, seat adjusters, different kinds of trim, plastic, and stuff like that, hardware plant. But I decided, because GM offered it, I decided to take my educational leave and go to Arizona State University to get my master's. So when I graduated from Arizona State in 1986 with my master's in electronics, so I was now dealing with the high-tech electronic stuff, Fisher Body asked me if I was willing to interview at a place called Delco Systems Operations in Santa Barbara, California, one of the divisions of General Motors, but the high-tech division. And so I said, sure, I'll go ahead and do an interview over there. And obviously going to Santa Barbara, California wasn't the worst thing in the world either, especially at 23 years old, whatever I was. So anyway, I go over there and I start working on what you now see, believe it or not, this is 1986. And my first assignment is actually all of this automated vehicle stuff, collision warning and object detection and so forth. I do this for about 2 months. And then my boss says, okay, I got to pull you off of this. We need you on something more critical. You're the only person in our engineering center that has a mechanical engineering degree. Everybody else is electronic. And we need you to work on this airbag system because we're using mechanical sensors and nobody knows what the heck they're doing. So basically that switched me over in probably November of 1986. I start working on the airbags. And at that time, I was sent to be the resident engineer for General Motors at a place, ironically, in my home state of New Jersey. And it was supposed to be a 3-month assignment. You're going to go there and you're going to basically understand their mechanical sensor technology, and you're going to help us get these sensors integrated into General Motors vehicles. My 3 months went so well that I ended up being there 18 months and launched all of the GM vehicles by 1990 with the driver-only airbag system. So that was my first foray into airbags. That had gone so well that General Motors decided they did not want me going back to Santa Barbara. They wanted me to go to Kokomo, Indiana, where I spent the next over 13 years of my career. That was the corporate headquarters for Delco Electronics. And Delco Electronics was given by General Motors the task of all future airbag development for General Motors. And so that's how I started. I was working mainly on calibrating systems. And then in 1994, a system that we were given by the Delco Systems Operations Group in Santa Barbara was the electronic sensor. So it's the first time we're transitioning to electronic sensing from mechanical crash sensing. And when I talk about sensing, I mean the system that determines whether or not to deploy airbags. And this will be important later. So from there, I'm helping calibrate this system, but I'm seeing all the things that I perceived as flaws, things that I thought were, this could be better. I don't like the way this is working. So my group at Kokomo, Indiana, my bosses said, once we get these calibrated for this first introduction of vehicles, 94 through 96, you feel free to go ahead and start developing a system that you think is going to be better. So ironically, my first official GM system designed by me, primarily by me, was introduced in 1997. But then the big deal for me, which got me all the notoriety and the patents and so forth and so on, I had foreseen, I guess, the advanced airbag development issues. We knew about the single stage airbag causing harm when it deployed to children and small adults. So 1999, I introduced the very first in the world advanced airbag system with dual stage airbags, side impact, capability for rear impact, capability for rollover. So the SDMG, Sensing and Diagnostic Module version G as in George, was my big claim to fame. So that gets me to where basically I was doing all of this work, designing these systems, developing for GM. And then at that point in early 2000, the next step was occupant classification, where we're basically trying to determine whether the front passenger is an adult, a child, or an empty seat. And so that's basically where I ended up doing that for several years. I left General Motors Delphi in 2006. I had no intentions of becoming a consulting expert. That was not something that was in the cards. I was doing other things. But I got found by a group of lawyers, the AIEG, and they heard that I had somehow become available potentially as a consultant. And so in 2007, I met with several lawyers, and I made it very clear to them, I'm not going to take frivolous lawsuits. I'm not going to take, I'm going to tell you the truth. If it's a defect, fine. If it's not, I'm going to tell you that. They said, that's what we want. And so ironically, 2007, I took my first case, a gentleman named Lynn Shumway, one of my favorite lawyers that I've dealt with here. I've got so many great clients. I got my first case, and we blitzed that case, and we won that case easily, won a lot of money. And I said, I could make a living doing this. So that's where we are today. I've been consulting now since 2007. Actually July of 2007. So this is exactly 17 years. I designed them for 21 years. I was with General Motors for 27 years because I had all the years of college that I was still an employee. I was an employee during that time. And now, since the 2007 timeframe, I've been doing nothing but consulting on typically automotive systems where airbags fail to do what they're expected to do.
Well, we're glad you made that journey into being an expert, because you are definitely a pleasure to work with. You're so knowledgeable. You answer calls, you answer questions, you're enthusiastic. So that's what we like to see in experts. So we all know that airbags cushion the impact of if I can speak today, collision, and they reduce the force on the bodies in the accident. But not everybody knows how airbags work. Can you give us an overview of kind of the from start to finish, how an airbag deploys, some of the key features of the airbag itself?
Okay, certainly this is it's a system. You have to understand that the way we design this, it's a big system. And basically what we're doing is we're using the vehicle crash pulse. When you run a vehicle into another vehicle or into a brick wall, whatever it might be, it creates a certain crash pulse, a characteristic deceleration. My goal, my job, certainly in the early days anyway, was to look at deceleration information from crashes that are non-deployments and deployments, and to design a crash sensing system that can detect that information, discriminate when to deploy and when not to deploy, and send that information to a primary airbag control module, ACM. We called it an SDM at General Motors, Sensing and Diagnostic Module, but the main computer. And so the main computer basically is, first of all, monitoring state of health at all times. So when you're driving down the road, it's making sure your sensors are connected. It's making sure your airbags are connected. It's making sure the airbag warning lamp is working in case something should go wrong. We have to warn you that something's wrong. So basically, the central module is basically the brains of the system, and I'm sending it crash data from all these different sensors all over the vehicle, and then with that crash data, the algorithm inside the brain, which is what I designed, that was my claim to fame, as I mentioned, basically takes all that information and decides whether or not to deploy an airbag, which airbags to deploy, and then when to deploy them. Now, one of the most important things about that is number one, whether or not to deploy. And our seminar today is primarily talking about when airbags don't deploy, when they're supposed to. But there's two different issues. You don't deploy when you should, or you deploy when you shouldn't. We call that an inadvertent deployment, and we've had many of those as well. So the key is that you have sensors connected to this airbag control module. It's connected to the outside world, and it's connected to these airbags and seatbelt pretensioners. Real quick, a seatbelt pretensioner, when a crash occurs, one of the things I want to do is take all the slack out of your seatbelt. I want to make sure that you're not going to have a lot of room to go flying forward, so I'm going to lock up your seatbelt. I'm not going to yank you back into your seat, but I'm going to put enough force on it to take the slack out. So now I've got you held in place. And if everything's correct, I'm going to deploy that airbag, and it's going to work as a system. The belt is going to stretch a little bit. Your head's going to be arching over the shoulder belt, and the airbag is going to arrest your motion. Now, we're talking about frontal airbags. The same thing is true for rollover systems and side impact systems. Basically, there are airbags all over the car, and depending on the scenario, the crash sensors will dictate what to deploy and when. And then once they've made a decision to deploy, the airbag control module has what we call electrical current drivers on board that actually turn on and send 2 electrical current amps of current to every single airbag squib and pretensioner squib. And that ignites. Anybody who's ever played with model rockets, I know I'm a dork guy, a geek guy, but I played with model rockets when I was a kid. If you ever did that, you stick this little a wire up inside the motor, the rocket motor, and basically you connect it to a battery. It glows red hot and ignites that rocket, and that's what makes the rocket take off. That's exactly what an airbag is. There's these squibs, they call them squibs. We send 2 amps of current. They get red hot instantaneously and set off the propellant. Different airbags have different types of propellant, but either way, the squib ignites the propellant, which inflates the airbag. Some of the things to keep in mind: crash sensing has to happen. I'm talking frontal impact primarily today. For frontal impact crashes, I've got to make a decision to deploy within between 20 and 50 milliseconds, thousandths of a second. So you got to wrap your head around that. I'm going to make a decision whether or not to deploy within 50 thousandths of a second. And that's how these systems work. It's incredible. I was actually stunned when I was first getting involved in this, how quickly these decisions had to be made. And then the airbag inflates anywhere between 30 and 50 milliseconds as well. So the goal is that I've got to command the airbag out, and it's got to be fully inflated by the time you get there. That's the whole purpose. Now, in a really severe crash, there are other systems outside of my control. But for example, your steering wheel, your steering column, you may not know this, but if you hit it hard enough, it will actually collapse into itself. It's called column stroke. It's actually designed to absorb additional energy. So if I've given you an airbag and you've got a seatbelt, but that crash is so severe that you're still moving forward, if you get all the way to the steering wheel, the steering column is going to stroke and actually absorb more energy. The goal is to absorb as much energy as we can with the airbag, with the vehicle crash pulse, with the steering column, in order to basically minimize how much energy you personally have to absorb, because you can only handle so much, and then it becomes a catastrophic injury or fatality. So the whole system has to work together, and this includes the vehicle structure, as I talked about, steering column, crash sensors, airbags, seat belts, knee bolsters. For example, if a lot of times you're going to slam forward, your knees are going to slam into the dashboard. It looks like just a piece of plastic. Nowadays, there's actually knee airbags, but that piece of plastic was actually, it's behind there is what we call a knee bolster. It's actually sheet metal, but it's designed to absorb energy so that you don't break your femur. So ultimately, there's so many pieces of this, but for our purposes, we're focused mainly on the crash sensing and whether or not an airbag should deploy or not. But hopefully that gives everybody kind of an overview of all these different pieces acting together to protect you.
Thanks, Chris. So actually, before we get into the crash sensing failures and all that, let's talk about like type of crashes, severity in crashes that actually don't trigger deployment. Because I get a lot of calls from people saying, I was in a crash, my airbag didn't deploy, it should have. I think I have a claim for an airbag non-deploy. So can you discuss, I guess the first thing, one thing that I always, I think it's kind of a difficult concept to understand, but I think it's important, are thresholds. Can you kind of give an overview of what that means?
Yes. Basically what happens is we only want to fire the airbags, deploy. I say fire, deploy, same thing. We only want to deploy the airbags when you are at serious risk of harm or fatality, because the airbag can induce a significant amount of energy into the system. And if we fire the airbag when we should not, you could be hurt by the airbag. We could actually hurt you with the airbag more than the crash itself was going to hurt you. So what we did and what General Motors did, obviously this is more biomechanical than me, they determined that when you have 1.78 kilonewtons load on the facial bones, you start fracturing facial bones. So General Motors set their must deploy threshold for every vehicle at the speed where a crash dummy without an airbag is going to reach 1.78 kilonewton facial load. Okay, so now we have this, we must have an airbag by then, because we do not want you to experience that 1.78 kilonewtons. And that basically set the original threshold for must deploy. Now, the no deploy was basically set based on system tolerances. We knew we had to deploy the airbag, let's say, by 14 miles an hour. And by the way, when we say 14 miles per hour, for the sake of simplicity and for the sake of repeatability, we typically run the vehicles into a brick wall. So it's a perfectly repeatable test, as opposed to running into car to car. Things get more complex and things can change angle and so forth. So when we're setting this threshold and determining this threshold, it's based on running the vehicle into just a flat brick wall. And that's the typical initial barrier test. So we set those thresholds. We set it, let's say, at 14 miles per hour. Then General Motors comes to me and says, okay, if I have to fire the airbags guaranteed by 14 miles per hour into this rigid barrier, what is my non-deploy? Because again, my system has tolerances. I've got mechanical parts and electrical parts and manufacturing processes, vehicle variability. So basically, we run a computer simulation of our system with all the other variables factored in. And if General Motors says, okay, I need to fire by 14 miles an hour, I'll come back and tell them, okay, it looks like we're going to be able to be a must no deploy by about 10 miles per hour. So what Jessica's referring to are those thresholds, and the fundamental threshold is set based on occupant injury. Everything in the whole system is generally based on occupant injury. And that's why when the occupant injury is going to be lower than a certain level, we don't want to deploy the airbag or the pretensioners. Number one, because we could hurt you in the worst case. Number two, sometimes nowadays in these modern vehicles, if we fire all the airbags in a crash, that vehicle's totaled. The insurance company will not repair that vehicle because it costs thousands of dollars to replace all the pretensioners and the airbags and the inflators and the dashboard. So fundamentally, we don't want to deploy an airbag when it's not needed. And part of that, again, is we could hurt you. Now, if any of you are old farts like me, you probably remember that back in and this is why I developed the new system for 1999 that I mentioned earlier. Because in 1994, 1995, 1996, we introduced the front passenger airbag for the first time. And all of a sudden, you have an out-of-control situation. You have a driver. You basically know where the driver is. You know what they're doing for the most part. It's an easy situation to protect them. You get onto the passenger side, you have children, you have adults reclined in the seat sleeping, you got people that are put their feet up on the dash. We knew going in that putting a front passenger airbag on the passenger side was going to potentially cause harm. Now, General Motors, in their wisdom, was smart because they were the first ones to develop what we call a top-firing airbag for the passenger side. So instead of deploying the airbag straight out at you, which is we call punch out, we actually deploy the airbags in a GM vehicle up into the windshield. It deflects off the windshield and flops over the dashboard. That took all the punch out of the airbag because it was basically breaking the window. It would break the windshield and then flop over and protect the passenger. But the reason I mention this is that in this time frame, especially Chrysler, and especially I think it was Nissan, if you go back and look in the 96, 97 time frame, it wasn't huge, but it was very, very publicized. The number of fatalities, the number of people on the passenger side in particular that were getting killed, children, adults getting killed by the airbag on the front passenger airbag. Again, it wasn't a lot. It was a very small percentage, but it was hugely publicized. And people became afraid of airbags. And this is why people like myself said we can make this better, because we don't need to fire this full-powered airbag in a threshold type collision. We only need the full power when we're in a really serious crash event. So that's basically the idea of thresholds, is that basically we first of all set a limit where we fire the airbag based on occupant injury. We know we're going to be able to protect you now, and we know that the injuries that you will suffer would outweigh the typical injuries that you would get from an airbag deployment. But again, below that, we don't want that airbag. We don't want to take a risk of hurting you. And then, of course, there's this repairability issue. It's a huge cost to replace an airbag system that's been deployed.
Thank you. So I've even had some that are fender benders. They call me and they say, the airbag didn't deploy, or what can you do for me? Can you just give some examples, like some obvious examples of collisions where you wouldn't expect an airbag to deploy?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, most collisions, the majority of collisions happen at very low speed. They're fender benders. And so somebody sees a dent in their bumper and they think, oh my God, my airbag was defective, it didn't deploy. When you have a crash that's of the level of a deployment threshold, you know, the vehicle damage to the front of the vehicle is significant. I mean, you're gonna basically have to replace your bumper, possibly your grille, possibly your radiator if it was hard enough. So, you know, what you said is exactly the case. People believe that every time they crash that car, they need to be protected by the airbag. And one of the funny stories goes back into the early 90s where somebody had called up and asked, you know, hey, you know, my airbags didn't deploy. Something was wrong with the system. And my response was, are you calling me from the hospital? And they said, no. I said, well, did you get hurt? No. Then you didn't need an airbag. So, and I explained to them what I'm explaining to you folks is that again, if I had deployed that, especially in 1992, 93, if I had deployed that airbag, you might be calling me from the hospital because there was no need for it and it could have broke your arm or caused some harm. So primarily what you see in the industry, in the field, what we call the field, the out real world, is fender benders. You know, people have these minor fender benders, very low G levels. Another thing to remember too, this is probably not going to be important today, but in the future, if you're looking at these things, don't let people confuse you with delta V, change in velocity, okay? Because one of the confusions is people will tell you, well, the delta V was 12 or was 16 miles an hour, okay? What's really important is the G level, okay? G's are what hurt you, not delta V. And the simple example I give for that when I'm sitting in trial trying to explain delta V is I look at the jury and I say, most of you drove your own car to the court today. And most of you at some point came to a red light and had to slow down to a stop. Let's say you're doing 35 miles an hour and you slow down to stop for a red light. That's a 35 mile per hour delta V. Did you need an airbag? Of course not. What ends up being important is time, how quickly that event of deceleration of delta V takes place. And in a crash test, the entire crash is over in 100 milliseconds, round numbers. 100 milliseconds, it's over. You hear the noise for a long time, glasses flying through the air and stuff's happening. The crash is over at 100 milliseconds, okay? So that 16 mile or that 14 mile per hour must deploy threshold, that occurred over 100 milliseconds, and the G levels were around 10 to 12 Gs. That is what hurts you. Okay, it's the Gs. So again, when we deal with these fender benders, we're getting 3, 4 Gs. I mean, you're basically just being held back by the belt. If you're not belted, you know, maybe you might bump your head, but you're not going to get a catastrophic injury. So again, we don't want the airbag in these fender benders, these little things where you're really in a situation where you're just going to walk away. But if the airbag fires, I could hurt you. And I've had many of those cases in my 17 years as a consultant where people have been catastrophically injured by airbags. Sadly, and ironically, Mercedes and BMW tend to be the worst, where people are getting seriously injured because of the airbag deployment and not the crash.
All right. So let's kind of move into what you spoke about earlier, sensor defects. So how critical is the location of sensors in ensuring proper airbag deployment?
I love this question because, you know, when I was designing these systems and I gave presentations to the SAE, I wrote papers on this, and of course I put documents together internally for GM. Basically, we used to joke about the crash sensors as if it was real estate. The 3 most important things for crash sensing: location, location, location. Same thing you say in real estate. Because if you put the sensor in a bad position, a bad location, either you're going to have difficulty keeping things from deploying that shouldn't, or you're going to have difficulty discriminating things that should deploy in a timely manner. And one of the things I probably deal with as much as anything in this industry is when I go and I look at another OEM's vehicle, I'm doing an inspection of a failure of the system, whether it was an inadvertent deployment or a failure to deploy. Probably 70% of the time, Jessica, it comes down to the sensors are poorly placed. I've got one right now, mainly a side impact one, but I got a side impact one right now. I'm stunned that they were even able to pass the federal motor vehicle safety standards with where these sensors are located. So sensor placement is everything. If you place the sensors properly, the calibration of the sensors, how to discriminate deploy, no deploy, becomes much easier.
Okay. Is there any, this is something I'm most curious, is there any kind of like calibration of sensors that needs to be done for like a maintenance purpose to make sure they function properly?
There's not, but you know, sadly, what you really have to watch for is the aging of the structures around the sensors. Sensors are hermetically sealed and they last pretty much forever. But the problem is, let's say, and it's less in the modern era, but if you think back to the 80s and 90s, maybe the 70s and 80s, you know, rusting out of a car was a big deal. When you rusted out your bumper, rusted out your frame, rusted out your sheet metal. Bottom line is, those sensors are calibrated based on the original design of the structures around it. And so if those structures, if you have a minor fender bender and you hit the structure that holds a sensor and the sensor rotates, for example, the sensor bends a little bit, rotates, okay, it didn't fire, but now it's not looking in the proper direction. So fundamentally, the sensors don't need to be recalibrated. They don't need to be you know, modified or changed or updated, but they still have to function based on the performance of the structures around it that are transmitting the signal to that sensor. So the biggest fear you would have is not so much the sensor itself, but its surroundings. If, like, for example, on trucks, you'd be amazed when some people put these crazy looking bumpers on the front of a pickup truck. You know, sometimes they're there for a reason, you know, animal guards, whatever they might be. They change the crash pulse. And so we had to spend a lot of time at General Motors designing these things to be able to handle aftermarket equipment to a limit, to a point. We can't handle everything, but we try to take into account that people are going to modify these vehicles. But if you had a crash test, if you had a crash, even if the airbags didn't deploy, you want to make sure that the front structures are repaired back to OEM original. Otherwise, I can't guarantee the sensors are going to work the way they were designed.
Yeah, you just answered my next question, because I was wondering how that would affect airbag deployment if they were in some sort of crash before where the bumper was crushed. And so you answered that question. But another thing I want to ask you about is crash sensing algorithms. I'm not doing well with these words today. Can you explain how they work and what might cause them to fail?
Yeah, basically the algorithm is the computer program that's taking all of the incoming data from all the different sensors, and it's basically looking at all that data and saying, is this a deployment event or a non-deployment event? So we get all this acceleration data in from all the sensors, and then we calculate things like delta V. We calculate things like change in acceleration. We calculate oscillation, jerk. There's different parameters, physical parameters. And based on the magnitude of those parameters, we determine whether or not to deploy the airbags. So an algorithm is simply a computer program that's number crunching all this incoming data and then making a decision based on thresholds that we've already talked about. We've already set the thresholds for each of these different criteria. If any of those criteria exceeds that threshold that's been set, so the calculations of the algorithm then compare, every time you do a calculation, you compare to a threshold. If you've crossed that threshold, you deploy the appropriate airbags and pretensioners. So the algorithm, in the old days, these were mechanical sensors. They basically, there was no algorithm. They just basically, if the main sensing unit touched the contacts, because it was basically a separation. If you touch the contacts, you fired the bags. But the algorithm is the way we take electronic data from all the accelerometers we place on the vehicle, and then we number crunch those with this algorithm. And the algorithm is what basically then compares to the thresholds and determines whether or not to deploy the airbags. And algorithms were my thing. When I talk about the 1999 system, the things that I developed was the crash sensing algorithm. I developed the technology for the electronic front sensors. 1999 was the first introduction of electronic front sensors as opposed to mechanical. And then I also introduced a lot of the evolution of crash recording, of what we record when a crash occurs, so that you can download it later and see if the system worked correctly.
And I think a lot of people are familiar, but would that be in an electronic data recorder report that you could get? Is that where you get that information?
Exactly. And I'm proud of General Motors, because even the original system that I had nothing to do with the design of the DERM, Diagnostic Energy Reserve Module, GM and Delco at the time, had the foresight to put crash recording in our very first system in 1988. Most OEMs don't start doing crash recording until the early 2000s. Our crash recording at GM and Delphi started in 1988. And then in 1994, with the electronic system that I mentioned, that we introduced the electronic system, at least the SDM, the main controller, had an extensive crash recording. Matter of fact, I'm proud of this as well from my years with General Motors. NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, mandated crash recording for all U.S. vehicles in 2014. Guess whose crash recording they used to demand everybody did? Ours. They took our 1999 system and said that is the role model for everybody's future 2014 and beyond crash recording. So we took it very seriously. We had a lot of fights. I hate to say it, we fought with lawyers, because our lawyers said this is dangerous, because now we're going to have all this data, and if we did something wrong, then they're going to be able to find out. Our engineering attitude was just the opposite. If we did something wrong, I want to know, because I need to fix it as quickly as possible. And if I don't have crash recording, I won't know what happened. And ironically, crash recording was how we solved a major crisis at General Motors on the Cavalier Sunfire, I think it was, in 1997, because we were having inadvertent deployments in the field. We had airbags going off just driving down the road. And if it wasn't for that crash recording, we would have never known what was going on. But we saw something very unique in the crash recording, and myself working with GM engineers directly, we solved that quickly and recalled all the vehicles and solved that problem. But again, it was the crash recording that in the end saved us. Luckily, nobody ever got hurt. But again, the point was that was an engineering tool. It wasn't meant to be a legal tool, but now it is.
Yeah, absolutely. At this time, Chris, we're going to take a little bit break so we can bring in our partners. Ginger, she's right there, so I'll turn it over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jessica. And Chris, this has been a wealth of information. I mean, oh my gosh, I cannot get over it. You have been doing an amazing job.
Thank you.
We're going to take just a very quick break because I want to get right back to it. But we've got Ingrid coming in with OnPoint Legal Nurse Consulting, and I'm so happy that she's here. You guys, she's got over 40 years of experience, and she is just amazing. She works with OnPoint with Patrick, and you guys know Patrick will be back with us next week. But everybody on their team is incredible to work with, and they can help you out with a variety of things. But as you guys know, John Romano raves about the pain and suffering reports that they do. They are top notch. Right, Ingrid?
Yeah, we had 2 attorneys, thanks to Last Connectionology, reach out to us for samples, which we're happy to send. You know, in accidents like car accidents, when people suffer for a long time, nurses know how to put that all down in easy language to understand, that's used in mediation and trials. I myself have done several of them. They're fun to do, and they're a great way for nurses to explain pain and suffering and all the other bad outcomes of various accidents, et cetera. But I'm, for those who don't know, I'm a master's prepared geriatric nurse, did ICU for 10 years, then got my degrees because I couldn't keep doing it. Patrick, that I work with, is also a longtime geriatric nurse. We take care of all the geriatric nursing home cases where bad things happen to old people in various health settings. My colleague, Don Montagno, manages all the expert location and pain and suffering cases for anything non-geriatric. So we do soup to nuts, everything that you need, whether it's record retrieval and organization with bait stamping and OCRing, to merit screens with a simple yay, nay, to doing things like sending you an email to explain why it's not a case so that you can explain it to the family more easily. Actually doing family interviews with folks to sort of get more information and see where the family's coming from. I have certainly uncovered issues with families that you know, it's because of anger, not really that anything wrong was done, et cetera. To expert location all over the country of whatever kind of expert you need. It is, you know, whether it's a forensic specialist or a medical person, we do it, and we do it swiftly, and we make sure you're happy with the outcomes. We're here to discuss cases and help you figure out who the defendants should be. We have life care planners. We do IMEs and DMEs in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. You know, financial reviews, whatever it is you need, we're here to help. So thank you again. I'm learning a lot. I did have an airbag deployed once, and it did make a difference in my outcome. So thank you for all the work you've done, Chris. Wow, who knew? So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ingrid. And please put your information in the chat box so that way everybody can contact you. And I hope everyone watching will save Ingrid's information and reach out at any point, especially if you have some more questions. But we just love working with this group. So thank you guys for supporting them. And now I can see that, let's see, Jonathan with EmotionTrac is coming in just a moment. And I'm so excited to have him with us, you guys, because again, you've probably heard us raving about this company doing amazing work with AI technology and jury selection and how they can read the emotions of the jury. They can save you a lot of time when you're working on your cases. So Jonathan's here to explain a little bit more detail, and hopefully he will share some testimonials because he's working with some awesome attorneys around the country too. Hey, Jonathan.
Hi, I got a new testimony for you today, so good.
Awesome.
I can never tell who has seen this before, so I feel like I'm repeating myself all the time. But let me just I'll bore you for a second here. Just a quick overview of what we do. But essentially, as you'll see in a minute here, our job is very simple, right? We're just trying to help you guys win and win more, win bigger, period. And so how do we do that? People make decisions based on emotions and feelings, right? And so our job is to capture that nonverbal communication, so you will know exactly how your case is going to resonate when you're telling your story. And this is how we do it. It's big data. People like to use that word these days, but you present your story in front of 100 or more panelists. We help you do all that. You fold in demonstratives, you narrate your story. We pick a panel audience based on where the venue is and the way you want that to look. We put together survey questions that you can ask the panel as well. That's a qualitative piece. That's your presentation. We publish it to the panel, and voila, it comes back into the dashboard. We analyze it for you. We write a full report. We do a full debrief with you, so you know exactly what the data is telling you, and you can, finalize your argument or figure out what the case value should be before you go into mediation. This is just a quick snapshot of the dashboard to illustrate the way this thing works. This graph here is really neat because it's really the graphical display of the emotions being picked up by the panel audience. So where you see these big spikes, that's telling you that people are responding emotionally to whatever they're seeing, whether it's, the accident, a neck injury, talking about the value of the case, et cetera. You'll be able to see exactly moment by moment how people are responding. And this, Ginger, thanks for teeing me up here. This is another testimonial we got from, someone who's done a bunch of cases with us, but let me just put it in his words for you.
I get an assessment on liability, and it forces me to put together a presentation. If the trial is a year away, if it's 4 months away, it forces me to do things that maybe ordinarily I wouldn't do. I don't necessarily look at the technology. I just look at the results, and I trust the results, and I'm like, okay. Like when we did it last year, it was clear to me, okay, I can win this. We had overwhelming in our favor on that issue of vicarious liability. With Gilly's case on the bicycle, it told me I needed to settle the case. With Rebecca, it told me the same thing. I wasn't sure if she's going to be believable, likable. It told me she was all the above. So I was like, okay, let's just go. And then it forced it. We were ready to go. So we got a good settlement out of it.
There you go. So yeah, I mean, that's just one example, but listen, if anyone has a case and you want to see how this thing works, or you want to just learn, let's set up an appointment and we can go through it together.
And I would say definitely call Jonathan, because even if you get a chance to go check out their website, I mean, they've got a lot of great things on there as well, but check out this company because they're doing really, just fast forward, innovative things over there. And like I said, Keith Mitnick, John Romano's working with you guys on cases, Ilya Lerma. I mean, these are people getting multi-million, Dino Colombo, huge verdicts. So definitely check them out because they can make a difference in your case. And I think you are also doing a special giveaway for anybody who books an appointment with you. And I think it only takes, 15, 20 minutes of that, where you can go over everything with them. And you guys can get a free Yeti cup, or you can get a cool t-shirt. So take advantage of that. We all know how much we love Yeti cups. So go for that. And Jonathan, please put your information in the chat box so everybody can stay in touch. Okay.
Will do. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Ginger.
Thanks for being here with us.
You bet. Bye.
All right, Chris, what'd you think about that?
Cool stuff.
Very cool. All
Very
right,
cool.
guys, we're excited to get back to it. So I'm going to hand it back over to you.
All right, thank you, Ginger, and thank you to our partners. So I have two more questions for you, Chris, before I hand you over to Sam. So my first question is, what specific challenges do rollovers pose for airbag deployment?
Rollovers are actually a relatively easy thing to discriminate and deploy. When you have a rollover, the goal of our system is you activate all the pretensioners to lock the belt down to keep the person from flying around the vehicle, and you deploy the side curtain airbags on both sides. And that, again, we're looking for ejection or partial ejection. We're trying to mitigate ejection or partial ejection of occupants in rollovers. So in general, it's a fairly reasonable, fairly easy thing to do. I mean, it takes rollover sensors, gyroscopes, basically, rollover sensors, lateral acceleration sensors, and then, of course, an algorithm. The interesting thing is, though, I started getting a rash of cases in the recent past of clear rollovers where airbags weren't deploying. And, you know, again, you need them to deploy in this case. They need to deploy, and people are getting catastrophically injured and killed, and there's no deployment, and the vehicle has a rollover system on board. Now, this happened to be key because it turned out to be only Chrysler, which they now call themselves FCA, Fiat Chrysler, or whatever. They, in their infinite wisdom, as they were engineering their systems, had determined that, well, if we have a slow developing rollover, that's the key term, slow developing or low information rollover, we don't know if the occupant may have gotten up against the side window, and we're afraid to deploy the side curtain airbag because the side curtain airbag could in fact cause harm. And so they basically said, if we have this criteria that we meet called a slow developing rollover, we're going to fire the seatbelt pretensioners, but not the airbags. Now, we had multiple partial ejections because of that. So I went back and was looking at all of their development data, all their criteria. And there was a couple things that stood out. Number one, you have curtain airbags on both sides of the vehicle, okay? And let's say you have one of these large SUVs, you could have 3 rows of seats. And in the worst case or the best case, up to 9 passengers in a standard full-size SUV. They're not deploying either curtain, even though only the occupants on the one side of the vehicle might potentially be at risk of being in the way of the airbag, okay? But people are getting ejected out the other window. Why wouldn't you have deployed that one? Why wouldn't you at least have deployed that? That had no, your data says that your person's going to move towards this window. Fire that bag. Why would you not fire that one? Because it's not hurting anybody. Everybody's shifting the same direction. And on top of that, their own data, which I knew going in, but their own data said they could have somebody right in the path of the deploying airbag on the side, but because of all these modern designs we've been doing since, you know, the late 90s and 2000s, people don't get killed, don't get seriously hurt by the side curtain airbag. It was designed that way from the beginning. So my point was, and we've ended up settling every one of these cases, but my point to them was the twofold. Number one, why aren't you firing the other opposite side bag? Because that makes no sense at all. And then number two, you know, based on your own data, that it's a low risk deployment. The probability of serious catastrophic injury to an occupant is low. So why not take the chance? General Motors, Ford, Toyota, Honda, none of us do this. We all fire the bags, and we don't have any injuries coming back from the field about people getting hurt from the side curtain airbag deploying in a rollover. We're saving lives. So the irony of it is, you know, that was the rollover thing was actually Chrysler. And the beauty of that is they were arguing with me multiple times about how, well, you know, how do you know other people aren't doing this? So one of my depositions, there was a woman lawyer there, I don't remember her name, and I get grilled for hours and hours and hours by the main Chrysler defense lawyer, FCA defense lawyer. And I have all my stuff ready. We go through the whole thing, but he kept saying something about, you know, well, isn't Bosch also responsible? I said, well, if Bosch was the one that told you to do this, then I would hold them responsible. But I don't believe Bosch would have told you to do this because I don't think they do it on any of their other vehicles. And I had said this multiple times that I would hold the supplier accountable if they're not telling you not to do this. But they kept pointing the finger at Bosch and TRW. So this Bosch lawyer at the very end of this deposition hands me a piece of paper and says, Mr. Caruso, have you ever seen this? And I read it, and it basically was a letter to Chrysler in this time frame saying, nobody else does this. We sell these systems to multiple OEMs all around the world. Nobody's asking us to do this. If you want to do it, we're going to charge you extra money because we have to change the software to be able to do this low information. So Bosch threw them under the bus in a deposition. So it's kind of a humorous thing, and they've settled every case since. But sadly, you know, rollovers. See, here's my point about rollovers. There is no such thing as a minor rollover. Okay, there's no such thing. You can have a slow developing rollover. You can go over just 90 degrees and people are getting killed because effectively, if you get a partial ejection, you end up with a traumatic brain injury, even in just a benign rollover. So basically, that was my argument, is that you're still better off taking a chance firing those bags, because the outcome you have when you don't is almost always guaranteed to be catastrophic.
Yep. All right. Thank you. So recently I had a case where my client was rear-ended and pushed into the car in front of them. What issues arise when airbags need to handle those concatenated events?
Basically, this is very important. And again, one thing I loved about my career working with GM and Delphi is that we thought about these things. You know, we basically always are doing the what ifs, thinking out of the box. It would have been so much easier for me as an engineer and for GM as a company to simply meet the federal motor vehicle safety standards, the FMVSS. That was relatively easy. The difficult part was what's going to happen in the real world. And one of the things we came up with, and this is way back when, I'm talking even in my 1988, 1989 electromechanical work with a company called Breed Automotive Systems, who was basically designing and building these mechanical sensors. The basic idea was, what happens if a non-deployment condition occurs right before a deployment condition? Is your system going to be able to handle it? Is your system going to recognize them as two separate events? Or are you going to basically not deploy on the non-deploy event, but completely miss the deployment event because the system is confused? And so one of the things we did from day one was design our computer modeling and our systems to understand and properly respond to what we call, and what you said, Jessica, concatenated events. A non-deploy event followed by a deploy event. And so in this case, the example you use is very critical. And we had to actually, because we thought about this exact scenario, we had to design a very specific algorithm feature to prevent this. Because what happens is you have all this data coming into the airbag control module, right? And now let's say you get a rear impact. You're being thrown into the back of the seat, and in that case, it's a positive acceleration. A deceleration when you're crashing to the front is a negative for us, and the way our accelerometer reads it. And a rear impact is a positive. What happens is you have a 25-mile-per-hour rear impact event. You get this big positive delta V. Now you transition into a rear event, a frontal event, and the delta V starts to come down, but it's not coming down from 0, it's coming down from 25 miles an hour. And so if I have a 25-mile-per-hour rear impact, followed by a 25-mile-per-hour must deploy frontal impact, my system is potentially going to register 0 miles an hour. Plus 25, minus 25, I'm back to 0. The system doesn't understand that the occupant has just experienced a deceleration of 25 miles an hour. So we had to design very specific criteria into our algorithm to recognize that if we have this rear impact, the occupant is not displacing into the back seat. The occupant is being held into the seat. And so when it transitions to a frontal collision, the occupant is still starting from point 0, whereas the original computer modeling would say, oh, well, the occupant's starting from the rear seat, so we have plenty of time before he gets to the front airbag. So again, it's all a matter of the system understanding what the physics of the occupant are and then properly designing for that. But many OEMs don't. I've had many cases like that where we have a rear impact followed by a deployment level frontal impact, no airbag deployment. And so there's two reasons. Number one is the algorithm gets confused, but another one that came up, which is very interesting, and I found this in a recent case. In the more modern vehicles, let's say 2010 and beyond, if you look at a Mercedes or a BMW, the batteries are in the rear, okay? Now, think about, I should mention this, take a step back real quick. When we were designing the frontal impact airbag system, this is back in the 80s and 90s, we knew that the battery of the vehicle was located in the front of the vehicle, okay? And we knew that it was likely to be destroyed in a collision. Well, what happens if we lose the battery while we're trying to fire the airbags? Okay. So our system since day one, back in 1988, contain what we call energy reserve. It's basically capacitors, call it like batteries. Inside the airbag control module, we have these batteries. If we lose power from the vehicle battery, we have enough energy reserve in our system. It lasts for 300 milliseconds, 3 times the length of a normal frontal collision, okay? We design, because again, you can't make it, if you make it too big, you got to put Tesla batteries in your car. You know, fundamentally, we're looking at small capacitors, giving ourselves 3 times the length of a frontal collision to make a decision and still be able to deploy the airbags. Now, think about what happens when BMW and Mercedes, in their infinite wisdom, stick the battery in the trunk. I've had 2 cases in a row now. The rear impact takes out the battery. By the time the front impact occurs, the 300 millisecond energy reserve, 0.3 of a second, is gone. The system is dead. It's asleep. Never even sees the frontal collision. So in my deposition with them, my comment was, what philosophy did you use to design your energy reserve? Because you're using the same energy reserve that we designed with a very specific goal in mind when the batteries were in the front. What energy reserve philosophy did you use when you stuck the batteries in the rear, and it's common foreseeable real world event to be hit in the rear when people are stopping for traffic or stopping for construction, whatever, to be hit in the rear and then be pushed into the car in front of you? They had no answer. They just basically used the same energy reserve that the industry was using. Yeah, but our batteries aren't in the rear. So but that's the whole concatenated event thing, is that basically 2 things can happen. You can lose battery and not have enough energy reserve and therefore not deploy the front airbags, or you can have a failed algorithm design that doesn't properly look at what the occupant is seeing and doesn't properly recover to recognize the severity of the frontal collision.
Well, thanks so much for indulging all of my questions. But at this time, I'm gonna go ahead and pass it over. Oh, and we lost your camera.
I know. I'm going to try to put it back on. I saw that I lost it. I've been having a little bit of problems with this camera, so I have to shut it down and turn it back on again. It usually comes back up.
When you come back, I'm going to pass it over to Sam, and he can take over. I'm sure he's got lots of good questions for you too.
Hey, Chris. Thanks, Jessica.
How are you doing, Sam? It's great to see you.
I'm good. I'm learning tons. I want to say this to the participants. Guys, if you get an airbag, non-deployment or deployment case, and you want to work it, want to do everything you need to do for your client, you need experts. I mean, these cases, you have to rely on your experts. Chris, is that not a very fair statement?
Yes, it is. And there's typically 3 legs. Now you have other things. You have doctors and stuff, but there's 3 legs to the typical experts. You have somebody like myself on the airbag system, somebody on biomechanical, and then somebody on accident reconstruction. Those are typically what we call the 3 legs of the stool to cover your technological experts. We obviously understand that you may have a treating doctor and things like that as other experts, but for our purposes, those are the 3 that, I mean, and we've got a group that works together so well now, that I've got great relationships with recon experts and biomechanical experts all over the country. But Sam's right. I mean, these cases can be expensive. They're even more expensive if you lose. So fundamentally, our goal is, if we accept a case, I guess I reject 75 to 80% of the cases as being non-defective. It's a misunderstanding of systems functionality. But when we accept a case, it's just as important for me that you win. Because again, number 1, I'm trying to build a long-term relationship. Number 2, these things are very expensive and I don't want you to lose. So I won't take the case if I'm sure you're going to lose. But even when you take a case, it's important to dot the I's and cross the T's.
Okay. Now, Chris, as you know, you and I met probably 4 years ago or so. You came to Arkansas. We had a good time. And that was my first airbag non-deployment case. And so I was fortunate enough that our firm and the Romano firm were very close, and they reached out to you and Kelly Kennett, retained y'all, got it booked, and y'all came out to Arkansas multiple times to do a ton of things with the car, and I learned so much from that. And so I have a few questions. We've got about 15 minutes or so maybe. And so I want to ask some basic questions that I feel like lawyers like me back then would absolutely love to know and they need to know. So talk to us about the importance of instantly getting you guys out here or out to the car to do downloads and inspections and scans. How important is that?
You know, it's critical. I've had several cases where the vehicle was already gone. So by the time some lawyer found out about a possible defect case, you know, we may have had scene photos, we may have had a police report, but downloads are critical. And I mentioned that after 2014 model year, all vehicles have to have download capability. But downloads are critical. They're not you can still survive without them. But generally speaking, downloads take away all doubts about things like whether the person was belted or unbelted, whether the airbags fired on time or they fired late. You know, what, like, for example, I had a case I was reviewing this morning, a clear case of occupant classification failure. So, you know, again, you see that the driver airbag deployed, the passenger airbag did not. You know, the first thing that runs through my head is, oh, it's possibly an occupant classification, misclassifying an adult as a child. But again, there's always other possibilities. And so when you have a download like I had today for this this Buick, it said the passenger airbag is suppressed because it recognized a child in the seat. So those things are critical. And one thing, you know, having a vehicle is super important. I've had only a few cases where we didn't have a vehicle. They're very difficult. So protecting the vehicle, keeping it out of the environmental, you know, heat and humidity and rain and everything, you know, covering it up with tarps or whatever, very important. You got to preserve the evidence. As long as you preserve the vehicle, the download doesn't disappear. We can download the vehicle 10 years later. The data is not going to disappear. It's still there. But protecting the vehicle, preserving the vehicle is utmost. And then, of course, like you said, Sam, my inspections are very important because let's say I don't have a download. My inspections become important because I'm going to look at all the details of that vehicle on as far as where are the sensors, were they impacted in this crash, is there any wires broken, is the battery destroyed, you know, is the seatbelt pretensioner deployed? Because once the seatbelt pretensioner deploys, the belt is basically spooled out forever. So there are things, forensic things that we need. You know, did somebody hit the steering wheel? Do I see a mark on the steering wheel? So fundamentally, the forensics is usually very obvious. The download, if it's available, if we can make it available, answers most of the questions that are outstanding. But obviously, if I was going to recommend one thing, as soon as you think you might have a case, preserve the vehicle. Preserve, and then everything else will flow from there. And as long as you have the vehicle and you protect it, you know, whether you put it in a storage bin somewhere or whether you cover it up with quality tarps, that's the most important. Because Sam's right, these inspections are critical. I can't even write an expert report unless I've done an inspection. Now, again, in a couple of cases where we had no vehicle, I put that right in the disclaimer. You know, that you know, again, I have not inspected the vehicle based on the evidence I do have. Blah 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 blah. But yes, great point, Sam. You got to protect the vehicle. You got to get the vehicle as quickly as possible, protect it, and then you got to start that whole process. Another thing about inspections, don't ever let one side do any significant disassembly or destructive evaluation without the other side having first been able to see the vehicle and second approving a protocol that allows you to tamper with something. You know, again, we never know where the fault is going to lie. And so it's very important that, like, for example, one time in a case years ago, one of my very first cases, it was a Kia Spectra. And the gentleman had put in an aftermarket radio. And again, being somewhat naive to the expert area, I basically just removed the radio and held it out and went in with a flashlight to see if if his wiring had somehow tampered with the airbag wiring, which it did not. And then I replaced the radio, but I did note that I had, pulled. Oh, they gave me all kinds of grief. Spoliation of evidence, and I'm sorry, the camera did it again. But so the point being that these inspections are really critical, and there you go. The inspections are really critical, and spoliation of evidence is always going to be a concern. So don't ever let one side unilaterally do something that might be considered destructive, like removing parts or disassembling something. We always try to reserve that for the joint inspection.
Okay, and is it fair to say that sometimes you have to come out and do a couple or 2 or 3 different inspections like you did in our case?
I don't like to do that, but unfortunately what ends up happening is I typically will go out and do my independent inspection, which is, us basically trying to confirm that all of our theories are correct and that we have a good case. I try to eliminate cases that are bad up front, but if we believe we have a good case, the next step is the inspection. The downside is, and I kind of alluded to it, eventually, depending on what the potential failure is, defense always wants to eventually do a teardown. They want to take a module apart, take it out, do testing on it directly. And so typically I'll need to go back there. They'll send a protocol. I'll review the protocol. In some cases, it's okay where I'll just talk to my client and say, hey, just videotape everything and look for this. The problem is with damage to the vehicles, it's sometimes hard to tell until the defense gets there. Oh crap, we can't access this through this panel, and that was in our protocol. Is it okay if we access it through the other panel? And that's where it's good to have both experts there. That way, because otherwise it's rare that we end up with a third inspection. But again, that gets costly for you guys. I don't want to be out there more than twice, hopefully just once. But if it's important enough, I'll be out there the second time, because we don't want to have to come back a third time. We want to make sure that defense and plaintiff experts are there and can make on-the-spot decisions to make changes to the protocol because of something unexpected.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What would you think are maybe the top 3 to 5 things that in discovery that we need to ask for? What are the most important things we need from defense?
A lot of it always depends on what the situation is. For example, in occupant classification, you'd be asking for something very different than, for instance, a frontal impact crash. But let's say we keep talking about frontal impact crashes. More often than not, it's a sensing system failure, whether it be a concatenated event failure, an energy reserve issue. So the things that, if we focus on frontal for a second, you want the OEM, GM, Fiat, Kia, you want the specification for the frontal impact airbag system that they gave to the suppliers. So first and foremost, they write a specification for the system and they give it to, say, Bosch, and they say, Bosch, build me a system that does that. I want that first and foremost. What did you tell Bosch to do? Number 2, Bosch then designs a system, calibrates the system, and provides a computerized spreadsheet summary of results. And they send it back to the OEM and they call it a calibration sign-off. Because at the time of releasing for production, in this example, Kia would need to sign off and say, yes, I agree that this calibration is ready for production. And the reason this is important is because almost no calibration is ever perfect. There are always trade-offs and balances. And so when I look at it, assuming we believe it's a crash sensing system problem, knowing what the OEM told the supplier to do and knowing what the supplier ended up doing with this combined spreadsheet are the 2 most important things. Beyond that, you'll hear us talk about a DFMEA, design, failure mode, and effects analysis. Because once you identify what the problem was, the next question is, did you ever consider this? Did you even think about this? And the DFMEA is their document that says, these are all the possible failure modes we can think of, and these are our corrective actions. And more often than not, you'll find out that the thing that failed, they never thought about, never believed it could fail. So those would be the keys. And the same would be true of any system, but you have to, like in my case, I'm looking for assumption that this crash sensing system didn't do what you wanted it to do. Those are the things I would look for. But with any case that we work on, whether it be rollover, rear impact, side impact, occupant classification, I would help you define that list. I would help you define, what are the key pieces that we need to see based on our assumptions of what the defect is.
Okay. All right. I think that's really helpful for a lot of us. And so I had a question listed out here. It's what are clock spring coil failures and how do they prevent airbag deployment?
This is a big one. And primarily, I hate to keep picking on Chrysler because Chrysler had the slow developing rollover. You can go back and look at the history from the early 2000s, mid 2000s. Chrysler has the clock spring problem. Okay, what is a clock spring? If you picture your steering wheel, okay, especially in our modern vehicles, do you know how many buttons are on there? There's ways to look at your trip odometer, ways to look at whether you need an oil change, there's radio controls, there's cruise control, there's a horn, and of course, embedded in that thing is an airbag, a dual stage airbag. Well, they all take electrical signals. They all have to be talking to some other module in order to do that. And the way this was decided to be done, which I have no complaints about the general technology, is called a clock spring coil. If any of you people are geeks like me and you've actually opened up a computer, like a desktop computer, a tower computer, you'll see these ribbon cables, these long, thin cables with a whole bunch of, conductors, wires basically, but they're all flat wires, and you have a connector on one end and a connector on the other end, and they're connecting two devices together. Well, imagine that long ribbon cable, trying to get myself in the frame here, long ribbon cable, turn it sideways and turn it into a coil, okay? And now stick it down in the steering column. Stick it down in the steering column, put the steering wheel on it, and now when I turn my steering wheel left and I turn my steering wheel right, this ribbon cable is expanding and contracting, but it's always maintaining electrical integrity to those devices on the steering wheel. Now, the downside, it's still a mechanical device. Mechanical devices over time can fail. And so if over time, as you're turning the steering wheel for, 100,000 miles, you can start to break the ribbon cable, fray the ribbon cable. Now, if it physically breaks, your airbag warning lamp comes on and a technician at the dealership can dial, there's an open circuit to the driver airbag, and you'll be able to find out that it's clock spring and get it fixed. But here's the downside, and here's Chrysler's dilemma. These ribbon cables, they fray over time, okay? And they don't fully separate, but you're down to, imagine a wire where you have like a wire with multiple strands on it, all like coiled up together. And imagine that over time, it's been fracturing, and you're down to one last strand, okay? The airbag control module still sees the airbag and still thinks everything's okay. Because all it's doing is measuring resistance. It's saying, hey, I'm checking, and the driver airbag stage 1 and the driver airbag stage 2, I can still read 2 ohms, which means they're there. But it doesn't know that this ribbon cable is this close to fracturing. And now what do you think happens when you have the first 3 to 5 Gs of a crash event? Before you need to deploy the airbags, the crash is just beginning, and you've got a frayed ribbon cable that's facing down the column. Boom, it separates. And so now you've got this thing that's been weakening over time, and then all of a sudden, right when you need it the most, that ribbon cable separates, and you don't get an airbag because you can't send the electrical signal to the airbag. So that is what happens with clock springs, and the Chrysler problem was worse than that. I kind of showed you kind of like this visual where when a clock spring is properly mounted, it expands and contracts and expands. There's very little tension, okay? Unless 2 things. You installed it wrong at the factory, Chrysler, or you had a repair done on your steering system at a dealership later in the life of the vehicle, and they didn't properly recenter the steering wheel when they locked the new suspension part or steering part back in place. And now, instead of your ribbon cable being nice and loose and comfortable, it's bound up because it basically coiled itself, unwound itself, and now it's coiled up to one side. So now when you turn the steering wheel one way, it releases nicely. But when you turn it the other way, it clamps down on itself. And now all of a sudden you got all this tension. Every time, I'm making this up, every time you turn to the right, it just wants to rip that ribbon cable right apart. And that's how you get these premature failures that Chrysler saw.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thanks, Chris. Well, so we've got to stop now. We've got about 10 minutes left. We've got a couple other sponsors to introduce. We've got some coffee to give away. It's going to be a great ending to a great start and great middle. So I'm going to pass it off. But Chris, man, thank you so much. And we're lucky to have you.
Thank you so much. I love you too. And I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to do this.
Yeah, this has been fantastic. And I'll tell you what, Chris, I know every time I get in the car now, I am going to think about you, honestly, just because I'm going to think about the airbags and everything. And if I ever have questions, I know exactly who to call.
Perfect.
We're going to take another just really quick break. And now's the time too, guys, if you have some more questions, get those in before we head out. But I want to bring in Blue with HMR because he's one of our greatest friends, and he is here to share with you guys all the good things that they do over there. We've been working with them for years and years and years, and it's just been nothing but a great experience. So Blue, thanks for joining us today.
Awesome, Ginger. Thanks for having us. And as usual, always a pleasure being here with everyone. Chris, great content today, man. As some of you know, I was a firefighter in my past life, and in 2011 was actually the chief logistics officer for the Arizona Extrication Academy, where we would cut up those vehicles, Chris. So everything that you're saying, man, is awesome. I resonate with it, right?
Thank
So
you.
anyways,
Thank you.
yeah,
Nice
absolutely. To meet you. Thanks, man. So with that being said, who is HMR Servicing, right? So we kind of pride ourselves as the premier funding source for personal injury plaintiff law firms nationwide. We do specialize in catastrophic injury cases, brain injuries, spinal cord damage, amputees, the full gamut, right? There are three ways that we can be a funding source for attorneys and law firms, and I'm just going to go over those briefly. First of which is going to be case cost funding. This has become quite a big item as of late because attorneys are more and more seeing the value in experts and hiring experts and bringing experts in on their cases and shoring them up before they show up to, to fight for their client. That can become a heavy load for a firm, especially, depending on how many cases you have and you need experts on, things like that. If you have any questions on that piece, feel free to reach out to me directly. And obviously we'd be willing to step in and help you with that heavy load. The second funding bucket, I like to call them, is going to be medical funding. We currently operate in 39 states for the medical funding piece. The reason I like to bring that up is to let you know that we work with providers nationwide. If you guys have providers that you like to work with, we would love to work with them as well. So don't let that keep you from reaching out to me if you guys need assistance, with any medical funding. The last but not least is going to be the pre-settlement piece. I always like to say, and Ginger knows, this is a tough time for your clients. This is probably maybe the toughest time they've ever had in their life, right? Life goes on for them. They need to pay their mortgage, car payments, child support, all the things that, we take for granted because we work and we're able to do so. If that becomes too heavy, please feel free to reach out and we can step in and help on that piece as well. And as always, Ginger, thank you so much for having us. I do look forward to the coffee giveaway later. I think Ted's coming on for that piece. And yeah, hope to see everyone soon.
Oh, it is such an honor to work with you, Blue. And I hope that you will be coming to see us when we go to our next depositions, our trial seminar, which is going to be November 7th through the 9th. We've got Satch Oliver, we got John Romano, Dino Colombo, Joe Freed, Philip Miller, Christian Morris. I mean, we're going to have a great time in Texas, but I hope that you're going to come out there and hang out with us.
That's just an unbelievable crew, Ginger. And whenever all those guys get together, like, yes, I want to be, I want to be in that room. So, yeah, hope to see you there.
Awesome. And if anyone's interested, be sure to check out connectionology.com because we've got the details on there, and I'm adding the agenda today. So you'll be able to go check that out. And but thanks for all that you do, Blue. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Ginger.
And now, last but not least, Nathaniel has popped in today because Cody is out there traveling. I think everybody's headed out to the big conference, but we are so glad that you're here with us, Nathaniel, to tell us all about Fox-AE and the great things that you guys are doing over there with demonstratives and graphics, animations. It's pretty amazing, and I'm convinced that there's nothing that you guys cannot do.
Yeah, pretty much. I feel the same way. It's amazing. I don't want to brag on myself but I want to brag on my coworkers, and they produce such amazing things, and such useful things, demonstratives and animations. But to introduce myself, my name is Nathaniel Murray. I'm a mechanical engineer, graduated from the University of Missouri-Columbia, and I've been working with Cody, who's also an engineer, for quite a few years now, and I'm just loving it. Okay, so today I've got a vehicular collision that I would like to share. And this one in particular, the airbags were deployed. We don't have a whole lot of animations that we haven't had the airbags deployed. But in this case, it shows pretty much the majority of what we can do. So in this case, this was a 5 rollover car crash where a vehicle was coming around a corner. It was raining, it was wet road condition, and lost control and ended up hitting the truck that was coming in the opposite direction, causing him to flip 5 times total. And we do all the physics-based movements and everything, and all this was based on the physics in our software that we use. And then we like to show what happened right at the beginning, and then we break it down and explain exactly what happened. So in this case, plaintiff was traveling down the road, and at one point the defendant's car started to swerve back and forth. He started to lose control because of the rainy conditions. And I believe he was speeding slightly, and I think he blew through a stop sign on the intersection up above, I believe, but I can't remember exactly. Here, of course, starting to lose more control, overcorrecting it, and ends up crashing into the plaintiff's vehicle. And this time the airbags did deploy, thankfully. Otherwise, the injuries to the plaintiff would have been possibly catastrophic and fatal. So then we like to show the perspective of the, say, a backseat person. The client didn't want a first-person point of view because he wanted to see all of the airbags deploying and everything like that. But then what we do is we then go directly into the medical side of things, show all of his cervical injuries, whether they're bulging discs or disc herniations, pushing on that spinal canal, causing all that pain and sometimes even paralysis. But in this case, thankfully, there was no paralysis involved. But like Ginger was saying, we do practically anything you can think of, whether it's an animation, a still shot, and we can do anatomy still shots. We can fancy up your PowerPoints. Anything you need graphics wise, we can most likely do it, and we would love to have the chance to do that. We also have recently launched our out of the box website where you can go and purchase ready to go images or animations of a herniated disc or just regular spine anatomy or other anatomy like the brain anatomy. So go check that out. The website is prime.fox-ae.com. I'll post that in the comment the chat here along with my information.
Thank you so much. I mean, this
And
is
Nathaniel, a real quick question, Nathaniel, are you familiar with the Attorney Information Exchange Group, AIEG?
Doesn't ring a bell, no.
If you could get me your contact information through Ginger, there's 1,500 law firms in that group, and I'm telling you what you just showed me just blew me away. And this is something that we may have a really big network of people that could use your services.
Gotcha. And you said AIG?
AIEG, Attorney Information Exchange Group.
Got it.
And like I say, if you get your contact information to Ginger, I'll get it to my colleagues who I know are kind of the head of AIEG. At one point, these people are so good that at one point I was almost going to limit my client base to only AIEG people because they're so good at protecting their experts, but they're always looking to improve their capabilities. And like I say, what you just showed was amazing.
Mm-hmm. That was probably my favorite demonstrative or like the favorite video that I've seen so far because you showed it through stages. It was almost like seeing a story. So, and that's exactly what these jurors want to see when they're in court. So thank you for sharing that. And I agree with you, Chris. Awesome group. Now let's see. And don't forget, Nathaniel, please put your information in the chat box. So again, everybody can stay in touch and reach you.
Will do. Thank you.
Hope we'll see you back here again, maybe next week. Okay.
Yep, probably. Maybe not next week, but soon.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And last but not least, too, we've also got Ted coming in with HMR, so you guys know what time it is. That means somebody is going to win 4 bags of freshly roasted Ethiopia-style coffee. So how are you doing today, Ted?
I'm doing well. So it's been a good week, and it's always good to see you and Sam and Jessica. And it was great to meet Chris. I see he stepped away for a second, but it was a fantastic webinar. Learned a lot about airbags, and just I've got a lot of vehicles with a lot of airbags, so
absolutely
pretty interesting. But I am particularly excited today because I've never met. Oh, some good coffee right there.
Yes. So not to backtrack, Ted, but we might need to change our Ethiopia style to the Panama style coffee.
Very good.
Panama, he says it's good. So I think
I was bragging about it earlier. So I thought since you're going to do your coffee thing, I'd show you some of the homegrown Panamanian coffee here.
That's awesome.
We'll get you guys connected. Okay, Chris?
And we have to trade some.
So who is our lucky winner today, Ted?
Yeah, so I'm excited to announce, so this is a first last name that I've ever seen. It is Lisa Paralegal. And so I'm really curious if that's really her last name or not, but she's from BDIW Law in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So I look forward to getting some fantastic coffee out to her.
Yeah, congratulations, Lisa. And I'm thinking that might not be her last name, but if it is, that is pretty cool. So Lisa, congratulations. We're happy that you won, and Ted and I will reach out to you after this webinar. Thank you so much for supporting all of us, including here at Connectionology. We appreciate that. And don't forget, guys, if you didn't win, Ted will be back again next week to give away even more copies. So there's another chance that you can win. But thank you, Ted, for coming in. Thank you for all of the things that you guys do at HMR. We really love working with you guys.
Well, it's always fun. Love working with you guys as well. So have a great rest of your week, and
we'll see you back very soon. Okay, Ted? Thank you.
Sounds good. See you, Chris.
Now, Chris, behind the scenes.
Nice to meet you.
Good to meet you as well.
Getting a lot of wonderful comments about how they enjoyed this webinar. So I just want to say thank you again so much, Chris, for being here and doing this. Jessica and Sam, I see there's another question. Should we ask that one real quick before we head out?
Sure, we can ask it. And you kind of touched on this a little bit with the stages, but it says, can you please explain the significance of the dual stage airbags and when the different stages deploy in most vehicles?
Excellent question. Thank you. Again, once we realized what we used to call the single stage or the full powered airbag, back in 1998, the government made a knee-jerk reaction and said, depower the airbag. So without thinking about what the consequences were, we basically, well, I mean, without the government thinking about the consequences, we depowered the airbag. So let's assume a full powered airbag is 100% inflation pressure. We depowered them to 65%. Now, what that did is it made that punch out force lower. But here's what happened. We stopped hurting small stature women and children, and we no longer could protect the football players. So the big 200 and something pound football players went right through the airbag and slammed into the steering wheel and not got no protection, but got minimal protection. So again, we said, okay, well, what's the proper way to do this? And this is the system I designed in 1999. Basically, that 65% inflation even works for football players up to about 20-mile-an-hour impact speed, okay? Once you get above 20 miles per hour, the 65% doesn't do it anymore. So now you want to fire both stages of a dual stage airbag. First one gives you the 65%. The second one gives you the other 35%. Now you have a full powered airbag again, but you only fire it at high severity, 20 miles per hour plus. And that's what crash sensing does. So with my electronic front sensors up front, I can very quickly recognize if I'm in a stage 1 or a stage 2 level collision, and I can tell the airbag control module what severity we have, and it will go ahead and fire the appropriate airbags. And the important thing to remember is if I'm doing it properly and I fire both stages of a dual stage airbag, that is a recognition that the injuries you will get if I don't give you the dual stage airbag will far exceed the injuries that would be caused by the airbag. And so that's what dual stage airbags mean. And basically what it amounts to is we're going back to the full powered, but only when we need it. And we're going to give you the low powered that has a punch out that is not going to cause catastrophic injuries at all of the moderate speeds. And then, of course, the no deploy didn't change. No deploy, stage 1, stage 2.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chris. And I tell you what, I cannot thank everybody again for watching this today. We are recording the webinar, so I'm going to put this on the Connectionology YouTube channel so that way you can rewatch it or share with anybody in your firm. But Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. And thank you so much, Jessica and Sam, for being with us as well. Is there anything you'd like to say before we head out?
Well, I want to say thank you, Ginger, for setting all this up. And I apologize. We've had to delay this so many times. Either my schedule changed because of trial or Jessica's schedule changed. So I'm so happy we could finally do this. And it's a pleasure to meet you.
It has been such an honor. And it was, trust me, it was worth the wait too, because what you were able to share today, I am sure has helped out so many people. And I'm so proud of you for doing all the good work that you're doing and helping everybody and educating them and being involved in these cases and trials because it's so important. So thank you very much, Chris. And I'm sure it's not going to be the last time we meet, but I appreciate your help.
You're welcome.
All right, Jessica, thank you so much. We appreciate you guys and have a wonderful afternoon. Bye, everybody.
Have a good weekend, everybody.
See you soon.